Welcome to Spotlight on Schools. We focus on the Rochester City School District. I'm your host, Jim Strauss. This past fall, East High School Principal Anibal Soler Jr. was one of 10 Latino educators honored at the White House as Champions of Change as part of Hispanic Heritage Month. It's not clear if the White House knew that East High had been branded a failing school by New York State and was being taken over in the fall of 2015 by the University of Rochester. Nor was it clear if the White House knew that Mr. Soler will have to reapply to retain his job. At the White House, Mr. Soler was asked to sit on a panel and share his opinion about how the president can support education. He had a lot to say, and he still does. He is our guest today. Welcome to Spotlight on Schools.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into what you said in Washington, let's get a little of your background. You attended East High for 2 years before moving to Greece. You graduated from Greece Olympia High School, where I started my teaching career.
All right.
In a long cover story, Deep Pride at East, you were quoted extensively about the difference between your experience at East High and at Greece. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think one of the benefits I've had, being a school leader is my schooling is kind of taking me through 2 different settings. And, being a student at East, the variety of noise or factors that played into the educational setting was very different than it was in Greece. I think specifically I talked about where we start as students. So oftentimes students come in with larger gaps in the city schools and particularly at East. So coming into 7th grade, 1% of the kids are proficient on the state assessment. When I went to Greece, it was very different. It was a different set of expectations, and kids came in kind of having a different understanding of what was expected in school, behaviorally and also academically. And again, it was no fault to either group, but just the variety of factors in our lives that they were different. So I had a single mom household, grew up in that. When I went out to Greece, I was the anomaly. I was the only one of maybe a handful of us who had that type of experience. It was 2-parent settings. There was a variety of other learning opportunities for students that in the city, we use the school to provide to kids. And so, again, no fault of anybody other than economic challenges and just kind of the upbringing.
Okay. Well, can you describe the path that led to your becoming the principal at East High?
So I started my teaching career in the Rochester City School District in the year 2000, as an art teacher at Thomas Jefferson Middle School, which is no longer around. It just houses 2 other programs there. And I did that for about 3 years. I got my master's in instructional technology, and I moved into instructional technology, and I was an IT resource teacher where I would kind of go around the district supporting teachers on how to implement best practices with technology. I work with principals on how to implement best practice technology in terms of their work, train them on how to use certain applications. And then I moved into administration and became an academy director at Charlotte High School. So my first administrative job was at Charlotte High School in 2007. I did that for about 3 years, and then I was given the opportunity to take over East in 2009.
Okay. Let's move on to a different topic.
Sure.
With New York's adoption of the Common Core and Race to the Top money, more and more attention was paid to high-stakes testing. In high schools, that means graduation rates. It's been well known for several years that Rochester has had the lowest graduation rates of all the large cities in New York. It's no coincidence that Rochester is also at or near the top of the list of cities in the country with the highest rate of child poverty, concentrated poverty, and segregation. The graduation rate by August of 2014 for East High was 44%. Overall for the city it was 51%. For New York State it was 76.4%. In a September 27th column by Erica Bryant, she quoted you as saying this, quote, "My kids are starting out 50 yards behind the starting line, or they have a 50-pound weight on their backs." Now, this is information you shared at the White House.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, given the background of our students, the economic conditions of our students, we know inherently, based on all the research, that they're going to have less exposure to certain vocabulary. They won't be reading by grade level, oftentimes going into even pre-K, kindergarten, 1st grade. So we know they're going to have these gaps. And the way the school system's set up is sometimes kids continue to move based on age, but not necessarily based on having certain standards and academic ability. So it makes it extremely challenging. It's not that the kids don't want to do the work, it's not that the kids can't do the work, but it may take them a little longer to do the work. It may take them more time. So, the unfair thing with the graduation rate is we're all measured in 4 years. But if you look at the school's rate in 5 years and 6 years, you start to see exponential growth for an urban setting dealing with kids that have a variety of trauma in their life. And again, I think that's where we have to be careful, I think, as a system. And obviously, there's individuals who make decisions that enforce some of these policies, but that's basically what I meant. And my kid comes in 9th grade, he's not met state proficiency, but he may be 13 years old, 14 years old. Age-wise, he's ready to be there, but he may have some academic and numeracy type gaps that we now have to address in 4 years. And again, we don't necessarily have all the tools to do it because we're bound by time. But to me, the success is if the kid graduates, even in the 5th year, to me, that's still a success. And so when you start to look at the rates of urban centers in 5 years and 6 years, again, although it's not ideal and it doesn't measure up with everyone else, I think we need to start measuring us by kind of like the populations we serve rather than everyone together.
You had mentioned in an earlier article that 5% of kids coming into your school are reading and doing math at grade level.
Yeah, based on state assessments. So
yes.
If I were to take the New York State assessments, that would be my proficiency rates. And so now if I take 5% and then 6 years from 7th and 8th grade and graduate 44%, you look at growth and you think about, wow, that's significant. Kid passed 22 courses. He got past 5 regions with a 65 or higher. I mean, some people may say that's miracle work being done with not necessarily more resources or any more time.
Okay. Well, let's go back to talking about Washington. What else did you tell the president's panel?
So I had basically said that I think we need to have some courageous conversations as a country. I would talk about teaching profession. I have some phenomenal teachers, but it is tough work working in an urban setting. And the mandates that are applied to us are universal. They're across our boards, and we're asking teachers to do things that we wouldn't ask any other profession to do. We don't ask doctors to decrease the obesity rates of patients. We don't measure them by how many lives they save. But yet we ask teachers to get X amount of their kids to do reading by this grade level or math by this grade level. And it's just not fair because we're not taking into account all the other variables that our kids deal with. So I talked about, a neighborhood community, more of a neighborhood approach, making sure that resources were aligned between municipalities, between the mayor's office, the school district, everyone who's really servicing that community. I had asked the president, they had asked us particularly, what would the president be able to do for you? And I think one is kind of bring value to education again. I mean, he's an African-American male. We know that we have a lot of gaps in the African-American community, the Latino community, in terms of student achievement. So being able to have a president to have some tough conversations about not the importance of just doing well, but really looking at gaps in our systems and how we're maybe not addressing certain trauma or how we're not accommodating for the needs of kids in terms of prenatal care for families, before the child's born. Looking at all those gaps that we know, based on economic standing, other families are addressing and give a kid an early start, and they don't have a 50-pound, bag on their back. So that was kind of the conversation, and we really always hear, when it comes to urban centers, we hear about the Harlem Children's Zone model. So let's be courageous enough to just create that model, and let's not make it a charter only model. Let's make it something that we force public education and communities to own, and so that's kind of what I had asked.
Okay, well, we're starting a grand experiment at your school. We can talk about that a little bit later.
Sure.
But you met President Obama. It must have been kind of cool. What did he say to you?
Yeah, when you meet him, you kind of like, you're meeting the president, and it hits you kind of like more after the fact. Like, oh my God, I just met the president of the United States, one of the most most powerful people in the free world. But I basically just introduced myself, and he said, great, we need people like you in the profession. And he asked where I was from, and I said Rochester, New York, and I told him East High School, and he said, well, tell your kids that we need them to pull through. We need them to do well, and our community is going to be dependent on them. And he wished us luck, and there was a lot of people, so you didn't get much time with him. But the fact that I even met him was a surprise because he wasn't supposed to necessarily be at the event. We were with the vice president at the time, so it was in hindsight, it's like I can go back to my kids and say, I met the first African-American president of the United States. I met the president of the United States, and I got a photo. So
cool. Something you'll never forget.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Well, I want to change the topic again. I want to talk about suspensions. There's been quite a bit of attention to the issue of suspensions in the city schools. East High, it's the largest city in the largest school in the city, got 1,700 kids. Through December 17th, which is the latest figures I have that were published in the Democrat and Chronicle, the district had 4,500 suspensions, and over 1,000 of those were from East High. You were quoted as saying that about 380 students at the time were represented in that number, with the largest percentage of those being in ninth grade. Many ninth graders are 1 or 2 years behind in credits. You talked about that, and are at the greatest risk of dropping out. What can you tell people who try to make sense of those numbers?
Yeah, so I'd like to, one of the things I would just really want people to understand is it's not 1,000 unique kids and unique incidents. It's 380 kids with high recidivism rates. You know, some of those kids could have 5 to 6 suspensions. And I also think one of the things that we have to have as a conversation as a community is what's allowable, what's not allowable in our communities. And so we know in some of our communities language is a challenge. What's used out in the streets and in the community, sometimes it's hard for students to turn off. And you know, what's tolerable, what's not tolerable. And we have a lot of students who have, again, very traumatic experiences that may not make the wisest decisions when dealing with conflict. And you know, we have to also protect the integrity of the classroom for the kids who do make the right decisions, who do decide to do the right things. And so it's a fine line, and it's a tough line to balance. So I think people really need to understand and dig more into the numbers. And unfortunately, a lot of those kids are the overage, undercredited kids who have been in ninth grade maybe 1 year, 2 years. And oftentimes, sometimes they're even middle school students who have been retained maybe once or twice in their career from K through 8. So you're dealing with a variety of needs, and that we may not always have the ability to deal with them. And so that's the challenge. And unfortunately, one of our only tools with dealing with students with conflict or students who violate the district's code of conduct is suspension. We don't really have a lot of alternatives to suspension options for kids. And so as a school leader and as a school administrator, trying to support teachers, and you know, there's the SAVE legislation that we have to also support, which is teacher-based in terms of minimizing disruptions in the educational classroom. So it's a fine line, and it's a conversation I think we have to have as a community. I think it's one that we at East will need to have as U of R kind of unfolds and they revisit past practice.
Something that came out of that article, it says fewer than about 1/10 are the kind of suspensions caused by violence or criminal behavior, things like that. 90%, about 90% are the kind of things that you talked about, the language. It also talked about in-school versus out-of-school suspension. 66% are in-school suspension.
So that means kids are still receiving instruction, I think.
Well, are they? That's a good question.
Yeah.
Several years ago, several articles, you know about those, have come out that talked about how it was understaffed, very inefficient in school. Talk about that now.
Yeah, so I think the big shift was when Jean-Claude Brizard, superintendent, was basically removed the out-of-school suspension option at the time and forced everyone to have an in-school suspension model, obviously for a variety of research-based reasons and, again, social justice reasons to keep kids in school and keep them connected. So I think there was a lot of hiccups in the rollout of that. And I mean, at East, I know initially, and the initial articles prior to my time there was some issues with how that was rolled out and was it really productive. But I think in the long term, it's actually been a viable option to keep kids in school, making sure that teachers can still deliver resources to them to still stay connected to the classroom. It's still a tough concept. So I have a building of about 1,500 kids, and let's say I have 50 kids. That's a significant number. People would say, wow, 50 kids in in-school suspension, but out of the total population, you know, mathematically it's not a significant percentage.
Right.
So, but how do you manage 50 kids who are in school suspension? What kind of academic experience? So you're right, it is not ideal. It is not pure teaching. A lot of it is probably workbook-based, small group instruction, and you have teaching assistants doing it. So you don't oftentimes have a certified teacher doing it. You have teaching assistants. So there are some things I think can continue to be revisited on that model, but I do think it's an appropriate solution to support some of our kids. And some of our kids, their infractions are minor, so they may skip multiple periods. It's not a reason to send the kid home on out-of-school suspension, but you put them in school suspension for the rest of the day, maybe figure out what's going on, and again, that's where I think some of the work needs to occur. We have teaching assistants. We don't have counselors or social workers in there. Say, like, you know, what's going on with why you're not making it to class. So I think those are things that, as U of R comes in and as the school continues to move forward, that hopefully will be part of those resources that get readjusted and readdressed so that we do have a lower amount of suspensions. Because we get nothing out of suspending a kid.
Right.
And at the end of the day, we're still responsible for that lost instruction.
Okay. We're going to take a break now. We're going to come right back. Don't go away. Welcome back to Spotlight on Schools. We've been talking with East High School Principal Anibal Soler. We have been talking about the suspension policy in East High, and now we're going to talk about the University of Rochester taking over East High. And one of the things that was going to help probably the problem with the ninth graders especially is something called the big picture. This is for students who are at risk of falling through the cracks. It'll start this fall with ninth graders. What are your thoughts about that?
It's great. I actually went and visited a big picture school in Syracuse as part of the EPO process. Dr. Eubing and myself went out and actually visited the school. And
it was outside of Syracuse, Lafayette, right?
Yeah, Lafayette, yep.
Yep, some kids who have problems with largely Native American
correct,
population.
Yeah. So I had never seen the model in practice, but it was very ideal for what I believe these students will need. And the biggest thing is it's choice. So kids make a choice. Obviously, they get some recommendation as to, hey, would you like to look at this option? But it'll be self-driven. Kids will choose this model, and it was very small teacher-to-kid ratio, very loving, very caring, very student-driven, very much about what they're interested in, helping them meet state standards through their interest. Again, very family-like, and it was just great. Their results were off the chart, and it was good. And I think it'll be a good thing to offer in this community. They have a lot of demonstrated success in multiple cities, urban cities, and they're not like a charter school, so that they won't have this stigma that it'll be certain kids. It'll be choice, which I think is going to be great for our ninth graders who may have done ninth grade already and may be looking for a new experience to kind of get back on track and in a smaller environment.
A number of the principles, as you just mentioned, are going to be incorporated into the larger U of R picture as well. We'll perhaps get to some of those today.
Sure.
But I want to talk about changing culture. Even before the U of R plan, there was much talk in the media about changing the culture in city schools. One of the things that the district was talking about was developing a new code of conduct for students. What are your thoughts about what it would take to truly change the culture in city schools?
Well, I think code of conduct is a great place to start. I mean, I think we need to have a clear understanding at homes, in the community, of what's expected in school, what's allowable in school. I think we need to have a clear understanding of like the role of electronic devices, MP3 players, cell phones, what's acceptable use of those in schools, and that's going to be a large conversation. I think we also need to talk about just habits, just academic habits that kids should have in terms of expectation around homework, reading at home. I know our Dr. Vargas has really emphasized literacy and reading at home, but really not letting that message die in this community and making sure that it's present everywhere. And I also think we need to have a conversation that because we have economic conditions that impact our students and the families that we serve, we need to make accommodations for that and doing this work. It will also be very uncomfortable when you hold the line with some of our families and communities, and we have to be comfortable enough to know that we're not going to make everyone happy and we're not going to please everybody, but that we are trying to do it in the best interest of the school district, of the kids, and ultimately of the families who, if these kids can hopefully break some generational poverty and break the cycle and get some new opportunities that haven't traditionally happened.
When you say make accommodations for their backgrounds, I'm not certain what you mean.
So, special education needs, language needs. We have a huge bilingual population in this community, Latino speakers, and so being able to accommodate that. But we also have a lot of international students, Nepali, Burma, being able to incorporate the needs of their language for their families, being able to make sure we have translation services. And then if we don't, we have to admit that we can't meet that need, but not necessarily make it punitive. The kid's not able to be able to experience something because we didn't, as a school district, maybe make that accommodation to support that family. So that's what I mean, being able to admit that we may not be able to meet everything and we're going to need your help, but kind of be okay with that and say we need the help of this community to help address the needs of these kids. And so how do we do that together and in partnership? And I often think that there's a divide where a lot of our families rely on school to take care of school, because culturally school takes care of school, and knowing that we need more of a partnership.
Okay. Well, let's get to the University of Rochester proposal. You've seen it, I've seen it. It's been accepted by the Rochester School Board and the State Education Department. Has it been accepted by the Teachers Union?
Yes, it has. Yep, it was unanimously voted in.
And the Administration
Yes.
Union?
Yep.
Excellent. So we're talking about budget as we speak. It's going on right now.
Correct.
The final budget. But let's keep our fingers crossed. What parts of this U of R proposal seem to you to be the most promising?
I think it's what I really like is that it's attacked some of the kind of the sacred cows in an urban setting. And so what I mean by that is it's looked at the administrative union contract, it's looked at the teachers union contract, and it's revisited some of the things that have been harder to do as a whole school district to address, and in terms of flexibility of teaching, flexibility of administration, having administration be able to teach a class as well as mentor kids. So there's things in those provisions that I think are very attractive in terms of the collective bargaining units. I also think the model of the school design in the proposal addresses the needs of different groups of kids.
You're talking about something like the family unit, the advisory?
Yes, I'm talking about specifically one of the components is there's a family unit that every adult in the building would get a group of 9 to 10 or 5, I'm not sure what the number will work out, of students that they're responsible for connecting with daily.
Daily?
Yeah, and advising and providing guidance. So we know that family structure is a need for our kids oftentimes. There's oftentimes not the most connected, so they're compensating for that in the school design. The flexibility to have off-track kids start, later start times to meet their needs, condense courses so that, hey, you may have gotten a 62 on a class and you failed, so you really just need to focus on these standards to get a passing grade. So being able to do some of that flexibility, I think, will be nice. It's very customized, and they've been very research-based. So they have middle school separate from high school. They've added 6th grade to have more time with kids to try to adjust some of that, not being able to start at the same start line.
Flexibility, there's going to be an evening school. Is that still in the plans?
Yes, an evening school. There's going to be 2 alternative sites, one of them being the big picture, another one being a more intensive cultural program to work with students off-site. Again, very small groups, 60 kids, 40 kids. The evening high school, staggered start times for kids who are off track during the high school students starting later, middle school kids kind of being sequestered in the building. They may see some high school kids, but by far and large, their educational experience will not take place together.
Let me add this. Expanded student support center, expanded social services.
Yeah, so one of the things that the University of Rochester has been real critical of is making sure they've got all the right partners in the building. So working with agencies like Ibero, Center for Youth, NEED, Northeast Area Development, and making sure they got the right people in there working with the right groups of kids, being supported by kind of a student support center where it was like an umbrella where kids would have their social, emotional needs met. And we have a school-based clinic there. So when you talk about trying to get to the kid holistically, that's the plan, to be able to do that all on one campus.
One thing that stood out to me involving the teachers, teachers having common planning time, being involved in curriculum design and modification, teacher coaches, ongoing high-quality staff development. That's a big piece.
Yeah, and so the goal is to make East a place everybody wants to work at. So, there's that old motto that if you take care of the teachers, they will take care of the kids. And so the goal is that this is the best place that a teacher's going to want to work at as well. They're supported, they're coached, they have time to collaborate with their colleagues, they have time to develop curriculum, there's time to develop assessments, review assessments, work with children, and do it with their peers during the work day. Oftentimes there's that expectation, but it's not built into the work day. So that's the kind of the goal here, is that the goal is that we have people fighting to also work at this building and also to attend this school. So, that's the goal, trying to find a model that supports teachers, builds them, and does those things.
Okay. What do you think will prove to be the biggest challenge of this U of R plan?
I think sustainability. I think initially there was a lot of energy and excitement around it. There's going to be a lot of attention being paid to it by the media. I think a lot of the people who initially start out the work will be great. But I think what we're asking folks to do is kind of an all-in, all-the-time model, where once you come into work, you're about our kids, you're about the work in front of you your entire time while you're there. And actually that is the model that U of R is using, is that you're all in all the time. And so my biggest fear is that at any point, the U of R could walk away if there's something that becomes a roadblock or but the hope is that we do well and it starts to create a model that could be used in other buildings and maybe even reproduce in other urban centers. So that's kind of my fear, is the sustainability. What does this look like long term? Is it sustainable? Does it beg the question that maybe schools have been underfunded significantly, and we need to revisit that?
One of the things we talked about in the break was not only sustainable here, but reproducible in other places. Becomes a model. That's the goal of U of R.
Yeah.
Become a model.
Yeah, that's the goal of U of R, and I also think it's the goal of the Board of Education. I mean, they actually, President White has been very much at the forefront of this partnership and bringing U of R in and asking them to do this, because eventually there's going to be schools that are going to be quote unquote out of time and have not met graduation rates for so long, and we're going to need solutions for those schools. And so if this is something that works, then maybe this does become something we can replicate at another high school.
Yes.
So.
In Rochester, there are schools that are running out of time.
Correct.
All right, I want to change the topic yet again.
Okay.
Separate but equal.
Yes.
There's a growing voice calling for the deconcentration of poverty, at least as far as education is concerned. That voice is in Rochester. Activists are raising the old cry that separate but equal is never equal. It's playing out now as people are trying to expand the urban-suburban program and receiving pushback. We're seeing it in Spencerport. Our previous superintendent, Jean-Claude Brizard, said poverty is no excuse for not getting education. Yet I've had reform advocates here at this table, Dan Dermesich, Bill Kayla among them, on this program, who say that poverty creates burdens that are nearly impossible for the masses to overcome. Yes, there are occasional heroes who triumph, but the fairest way is to integrate, perhaps by going to a county-wide school district. At the meeting where I met you, I heard two principals, neither of whom are Caucasians, saying that they've seen evidence that this doesn't need to happen, that is, that integration. Where do you line up on that?
I'm one of those two principals. So.
I didn't want to say it, but okay, yes, you are.
Yeah, I firmly believe, just like our former superintendent believed, that poverty isn't a reason. It is a factor. I mean, I think no one will never discredit that. It is a factor. It does change how you work with these students. I think the bigger question is, do you have the resources to meet all the factors and the variables that poverty brings in it? And I think the original separate but equal, the history behind it was that they wanted equal funding for schools that were segregated. The Supreme Court's response to that was that separate was inherently unequal. So the people who originally fought for it didn't want necessarily integration. They wanted more resources for their segregated schools because they didn't get the same funding as white schools and black schools. So the response from the Supreme Court was that separate was inherently unequal, which then caused integration. So those schools they had faculty and staff that represented those communities and kids that were in those communities. So they had a lot of successes. And I think what we have to be careful now is that a conversation we can have? And I think you see it playing out in some of our suburban communities, that it's a very uncomfortable conversation to have. And I don't necessarily know if you ask the kids if they really care about that. What the kids really want is they want the same experiences that they have in the suburbs at East. They want the same experiences that they have in Brighton at East. They want to make sure they have those resources. And I think we need to make sure that knowing the challenges of our students, it's going to cost more because of the effects of poverty and the impact of poverty. But at the end of the day, when the kid goes for 6 hours to the suburbs, they still come back to the most impoverished part of the city. So the bigger conversation is, what are we doing for that community in the community, not just for 6 hours a day for schooling. So that's kind of my argument.
We got about a minute left.
Sure.
Let's role play. You're going to apply for that job of principal at East High. I'm your job interviewer. Why should I give you that job?
I've been all about East for the last 6 years, being a former student there. I'm committed. I'm a champion of change. And in the sense of the first question, I do believe it's possible. I do believe we can do this. And I just want to be given that opportunity. So.
Okay, well, best of luck as you lead East High. Those of us who care about the future of urban education are going to be watching you.
Thank you.
I want you to thank you.
Thanks
for joining us.
Appreciate it.
At Spotlight on Schools. We've been talking with East High Principal Anibal Soler, Jr. Thank you for watching Spotlight on Schools, and see you next time. Good night.